The wind howled faintly through the mountains of eastern Tennessee, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. The old cabin sat on the edge of a dense forest, its wooden walls weathered and gray, blending seamlessly with the wilderness around it. Inside, the stillness was broken only by the creak of floorboards and the faint, irregular tapping of fingers against a worn wooden desk. Jacob Collins sat hunched over in his small living room, staring at the glowing screen of his aging laptop. His face was gaunt, the kind of face molded by years of sleepless nights and bitter regrets. A can of flat beer sat forgotten beside him, and a small pile of bills and foreclosure notices cluttered the corner of the desk. He ran a hand through his thinning hair and leaned back in his chair, the wooden frame groaning under his weight. The house was empty. His wife, Andrea, had left years ago, taking their 2 children with her. She hadn't even bothered yelling or slamming the door on her way out. She just looked at him with the eyes full of disappointment and walked away. The silence she left behind had been deafening. Jacob stared at the laptop screen. A roulette wheel spun endlessly on a tiny pop-up ad, its bright, flashing colors promising impossible fortunes. Below it, a bold slogan read, "Your next big win is just 1 click away." He closed the ad with an annoyed huff, leaning back in his chair and staring at the water-stained ceiling. "Big win," he muttered to himself. "More like next big mistake." It was late, well, past midnight, but Jacob didn't care. He hadn't worked in months, and days bled into each other like spilled ink on a cheap notebook. Nights were the worst, though. That was when the loneliness crept in, when the weight of his failures pressed on him like a stone. That was when the temptation to gamble became unbearable. Once, he'd tried therapy. A local psychiatrist had listened patiently as he mumbled through his stories of lost bets, debt collectors, and the ever-present ache of knowing he'd driven his family away. But after 2 sessions, Jacob stopped going. Talking wasn't going to fix anything. Instead, here in this cabin, miles away from anyone who might care, he stared at his screen, cycling through gambling websites, some familiar, others shady and unfamiliar. He knew he shouldn't. He knew it wasn't worth it. But what else was there to do? The wind outside picked up, rattling the old window panes. Jacob glanced toward the sound and shivered. Even inside, the cold seemed to seep into his bones. He thought about Andrea, about the kids, about what they'd think if they saw him like this, wasting away in this old cabin, clinging to a habit that had already taken everything from him. With a deep sigh, he turned back to the laptop. His cursor hovered over the search bar. Somewhere in the pit of his stomach, he knew he was looking for trouble. But tonight, that didn't matter. The wind outside howled again, louder this time, as if it were warning him. The hours slipped away unnoticed as Jacob clicked from one gambling website to the next. His eyelids felt heavy, but his pulse quickened with every spin of a virtue roulette wheel, every simulated roll of the dice. The wins were rare and fleeting, but they sent a brief electric thrill through his body. The losses, far more frequent, only deepened the pit of anger and self-loathing in his gut. Jacob rubbed his temples, staring at the screen's glowing light. His internet search history was a wasteland of get-rich-quick schemes and dubious gambling platforms. The ads popping up now were different, though. They weren't the usual bright, gaudy banners boasting million-dollar jackpots. They were simpler, quieter, ominous. One ad caught his attention, a black rectangle with white text that read, "The game that changes lives. Are you brave enough to play?" He hesitated, Beneath the text was a small hyperlink, almost invisible against the black background. There was no flashy animation, no bright colors, just a simple invitation. Jacob's hand trembled slightly as he clicked the link. The screen went dark for a moment, then a new page loaded. It was unlike any gambling site he'd seen before. There were no spinning wheels or playing cards, no promises of jackpots. Instead, the page featured a single line of text at the center. "Welcome to the abyss. Prove your worth." Below it was a box asking for personal details: full name, address, date of birth. A strange sense of unease prickled at Jacob's neck. Most websites asked for some kind of information, but this felt invasive. He hovered over the box, his cursor blinking like an accusatory eye. Jacob leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his stubbled chin. He could almost hear Andrea's voice in his head, sharp and biting. "You never think before you act, Jacob. That's why we're in this mess." But the silence of the cabin pressed against him like a weight, and the dark stillness outside felt alive, as though the night itself was watching him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for just a moment longer before typing in his information. He told himself it was just curiosity, just one game. What harm could it do? The screen went black again. A loading icon spun in the corner, its circular motion hypnotic. For a moment, he thought the site had crashed. Then the text changed. "Access granted. Welcome, Jacob Collins." His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected it to address him by name. A shiver ran through him, but he dismissed it. He'd enter his details after all. The site probably just ran some automated script. The screen flickered again, and a game appeared. A simple dice roll. The stakes were written below in plain, white text. "Roll a 7 to win $1,000. Beside the winnings, in smaller text, were the losses. "Failure will incur a penalty." Jacob frowned. He'd seen penalties on gambling sites before. Fees, subscription costs, maybe a harmless pop-up ad. But there was something about the word penalty here that made his stomach churn. The cursor blinked over a single button marked "Roll." His hand hovered over the mouse. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to close the page, to go to bed, to forget this strange, unsettling sight. But another part, the part that had ruined his life, was already whispering in his ear, urging him to take the risk. "Just one more game," he muttered, his voice cracking in the cold, empty room. He clicked. The dice spun across the screen, tumbling in slow motion. Jacob held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. When the dice stopped, the numbers glared at him. 4 and 2. 6. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. He waited for something to happen. An error message, a request to try again. Instead, the screen flickered. The penalty appeared in stark white letters. "You will be watched." Jacob blinked, his throat dry. Watched? By what? He glanced around the room instinctively, his eyes darting to the shadowy corners and the frost-covered window panes. The unease gnawed at him, but he tried to shake it off. "It's just a game," he whispered. "It's just..." A loud thump echoed from somewhere outside the house. Jacob froze, his blood running cold. The sound wasn't the wind or the usual creak of the old cabin. It was deliberate, intentional. He stared at the screen, the words, "You will be watched," glowing faintly in the darkness. Another thump sounded. Closer this time. He rose slowly from his chair, his heart hammering in his chest as he moved toward the window. The yard beyond was shrouded in darkness, the forest beyond a black void. He pressed his face to the glass, squinting into the night. Nothing. But the feeling lingered, that dreadful, suffocating sensation that something, somewhere, was watching him. Jacob sat back down at his desk, his legs shaky and his breath uneven. He stared at the screen, half expecting it to show more ominous messages, but it didn't. The game remained static, the dice frozen in place, and the chilling words, "You will be watched," still hovering at the bottom. He reached for his beer can, only to knock it over with his trembling fingers. The stale liquid seeped into the clutter of unpaid bills, but he did not care. Something outside was wrong. He could feel it. The house was too quiet now, even with the faint whisper of wind outside. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His fingers hovered over the laptop's touchpad. Maybe he should close the site, power down the laptop, and forget any of this had happened. But as he moved to shut the device, a faint ping echoed in the room. A chat window had opened on screen. "You're playing well, Jacob." His breath caught in his throat. The words were typed in a clean, blocky font, devoid of emotion or context. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. His hand shook as he typed a response. Who is this? For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cursor began to move on its own, typing out a reply. "Your hosts." Jacob pushed himself away from the desk, the chair screeching against the floor. The sound seemed deafening in the suffocating silence of the cabin. He glanced nervously towards the windows, the shadows outside darker and thicker than before. Another thump sounded from the porch. His chest tightened. It wasn't a random noise this time. It was deliberate. The unmistakable sound of boots on wooden planks. He forced himself to stand, each step toward the window feeling heavier than the last. His eyes scanned the yard outside, but all he could see was darkness. Then the porch light flickered on. 4 figures stood just beyond the light's reach. Their silhouettes were unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that made Jacob's stomach churn. They were tall and broad-shouldered, their faces obscured by shadow, but the faint glint of something metallic in their hands caught his eye. Jacob's mind raced. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a rusted fire poker from beside the wood stove, and clenched it tightly in his hand. His heart pounded as he moved toward the front door. His trembling fingers fumbled with the lock, but before he could undo it, a voice called out from the other side. "Jacob!" The sound was wrong. Flat, mechanical, almost like it had been pre-recorded. Jacob froze. The fire poker felt useless in his grip, but he held onto it like a lifeline. "Jacob," the voice repeated, louder this time. The doorknob rattled as one of the figures tested it. "We've come to play?" "No," he whispered, backing away from the door. No. The doorframe shuddered as something heavy struck it. Once, twice. On the third impact, the lock gave way, and the door flew open with a deafening crack. The figures stepped inside, one by one, their movements unnervingly precise. They wore black, masks made of animal heads that seemed to absorb the light, their bodies obscured by heavy coats. The metallic objects in their hands glinted faintly, long, thin implements that looked more like tools than weapons. "Who the hell are you?" Jacob shouted, his voice breaking with panic. He swung the fire poker wildly, but one of the figures caught it with ease, wrenching it from his grasp and tossing it aside. "We're your hosts," one of them said, its voice identical to the one he'd heard at the door. The others moved toward him, their presence suffocating and surreal. "Please," Jacob stammered, backing away toward the kitchen. I didn't mean to." "You've already agreed to the terms," the figure interrupted, its tone devoid of sympathy. "The game is only just beginning." Before Jacob could react, something sharp jabbed into his neck. His vision blurred as the room tilted and spun around. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the cold, unyielding stare of the animal masks. Jacob woke in darkness. His head throbbed, and his body felt heavy and sluggish. He tried to move, but his arms and legs were bound to the wooden chair he was sitting in. The air smelled damp, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around him. A single light bulb flickered above, illuminating the small, bare room. He was in his basement, a space he hadn't stepped foot in for months. In front of him, a folding table had been set up, its surface bare except for a deck of cards, a pair of dice, and a thick stack of papers. The four figures stood behind their table, their masks staring down at him like judges in a twisted court. One of them stepped forward, placing a gloved hand on the table. "Shall we continue, Jacob?" Jacob's breathing was shallow and ragged as he stared at the table. The flickering light above cast distorted shadows across the basement walls, making the masked figures appear larger, more monstrous. His wrists ached from the tight bindings, and his fingers tingled from lack of circulation. Sweat dripped down his temple, stinging his eyes. One of the figures stepped closer, holding the deck of cards in one gloved hand. The sharp edges of the cards gleamed faintly in the dim light as the figure fanned them out across the table with practiced motion. The silence stretched unbearably until the figure spoke. "This is a simple game," it said, its mechanical voice hollow and unfeeling. "Pick a card. If it's red, you win. If it's black, you lose." Jacob's mouth was dry. "And if I lose?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, a gesture that somehow radiated menace. One of the others stepped forward, placing a small, rusty tool on the table, a pair of pliers. Jacob's stomach churned. His eyes darted to the pile of cards, then to the pliers, and then to the figures looming over him. "You're insane," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't do this. You can't. You agreed to the terms." The figure interrupted coldly. It gestured toward the cards. "Play or forfeit." Jacob's hands trembled as he reached for the deck. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but the bindings on his arms and legs left him powerless. He couldn't even stand, let alone fight. The only choice was to play. His fingers closed around a card, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He hesitated, his breath hitching in his throat. Then, with a shuddering exhale, he flipped it over. "Black." "No," he whispered, shaking his head as though denying reality would somehow change it. The figure nearest him moved with a quiet efficiency, pliers in hand. Jacob thrashed against his restraints, screaming, but the bindings held firm. Pain exploded in his left hand as the pliers clamped down on his fingernail, tearing it away in one quick, merciless motion. His scream was guttural, raw, and unrelenting. The pliers clattered back onto the table as the figure returned to its place. "Next round," it said, voice as steady and emotionless as before. Jacob's chest heavied with ragged sobs, his entire body trembling. He stared at the blood pooling around his torn nail and the cards on the table. The deck seemed larger now, more menacing. His mind screamed at him to refuse, to fight, to do anything but play again. But when he looked up at the figures, their masks offered no hint of mercy. They would not let him leave, not until the game was finished. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Time had become meaningless in this grim, suffocating basement. The games continued, each one more twisted than the last, rolling dice to avoid an electric shock, guessing numbers to prevent another small, brutal punishment. Every loss chipped away at Jacob's resolve, leaving him broken and desperate. In one game, he was told to place bets on which of the figures would step forward. He guessed wrong every time, earning lashes across his back from a thin, barbed whip. In another, he was forced to answer riddles, the wrong answers rewarded with a bucket of freezing water dumped over his head. By the time they dealt him another hand of cards, Jacob's vision blurred from tears and exhaustion. He couldn't stop shaking, his body a collection of bruises, welts, and bleeding cuts. His mind was equally fractured, teetering on the edge of collapse. But even then, he couldn't stop. The allure of winning even the smallest victory was too strong. It was the same seductive pull that had destroyed his life above ground. The next card game offered a chilling twist. If Jacob drew a red card, the figure promised to give him food and water. If he drew black, the light in the basement would be turned off indefinitely. He stared at the deck through bloodshot eyes. His lips quivered as he reached for a card. When he flipped it over, the pitiful laugh that escaped his throat was more of a sob than anything else. Black. The bulb flickered once and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Jacob screamed into the void, thrashing against his restraints as the sound of footsteps faded into silence. He was alone now, locked in his own basement, with nothing but the pain and echoes of his tormentors' cold, mechanical voices. The darkness in the basement was absolute. Jacob's breath came in shallow gasps, each one a ragged reminder of his isolation. The silence pressed in on him like a weight, his pulse hammering in his ears. He called out hoarsely into the void, his voice cracking with desperation. Please, please, I'll play. I'll keep playing. Just turn the light back on. Nothing, only the faint drip of water somewhere in the basement, mocking him with its relentless rhythm. The chair beneath him felt colder now, the damp air gnawing at his skin. He tugged at his restraints, the ropes digging painfully into his raw wrists. Time lost meaning. Hours could have passed, or possibly just minutes. At this point, he had no recollection of when all of this had begun. Jacob's thoughts spiraled, twisting into incoherent fragments. He thought of Andrea and his children, the life he gambled away piece by piece. He wondered if this was his punishment, not from the masked figures, but from some higher power exacting divine retribution for his failures. A faint click echoed through the darkness. Jacob froze. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt of adrenaline through his battered body. He strained his ears, his breath caught in his throat. There it was again, a soft, deliberate sound like someone unlocking a door. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, I'll do anything, just—" The basement door creaked open, and faint light spilled down the stairs. Jacob squinted against the sudden glow, his eyes watering. Shadows danced on the walls as footsteps descended slowly. The figures returned, their masks gleaming in the dim light. Jacob's breath quickened as they're surrounding him once more. One of them carried a small box, its lid adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe under the flickering bulb. The leader placed the box on the table with a reverence that sent a shiver down Jacob's spine. The figure opened it slowly, revealing a single revolver nestled inside. Its polished surface gleamed under the light, and next to it lay a single bullet. "No," Jacob croaked, shaking his head violently. No, please don't." "This is the final game," the leader said, its voice colder than ever. "The stakes are simple. Win, and you go free. Lose, and the house collects." Jacob's mind raced, his thoughts a jumbled mess of panic and disbelief. He stared at the revolver, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. I can't, he stammered. You can't make me. You agreed to the terms. The words cutting him like a knife. The choice is yours, Jacob. Spin the chamber and pull the trigger, or forfeit. Jacob's head slumped forward, his tears falling freely now. Why? He whispered. Why are you doing this to me? The figures remained silent, their masks reflecting the dim light like lifeless mirrors. The leader gestured to the gun, its meaning clear. No more stalling. With trembling hands, Jacob reached for the revolver. The metal was cold against his skin, heavier than he expected. He swallowed hard, his entire body trembling as he spun the chamber. The sound echoed in the basement, a metallic click that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He raised the gun to his temple, his fingers hovered over the trigger, his mind screaming at him to stop, to fight, to do anything but pull it. But the weight of the figure's presence, the weight of his own failures, crushed him into submission. Just one more game, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Just one more. Jacob squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening in the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the leader leaned forward, tilting its head as if in approval. You live, it said simply. Jacob's sob of relief was short-lived. The figures moved quickly, untying him from the chair with swift, precise movements. His arms fell limp at his sides, his body too weak to resist. The leader took the revolver from his shaking hands and placed it back in the box, closing the lid with a soft snap. You are free, it said, its voice almost mocking. Jacob blinked, his vision blurring as the figures turned and ascended up the stairs. The door closed behind them, leaving him alone once more. The sound of their footsteps grew distant, then disappeared entirely. He staggered to his feet, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. His heart still raced, his mind reeling. The basement was quiet again, but the sense of dread remained, clinging to him like a second skin. He stumbled toward the stairs, his breath hitching as he reached the door. When he opened it, the cabin was empty. The masked figures were gone, leaving no trace of their presence. Weeks later, Jacob sat in the same chair in his living room, staring blankly at his laptop screen. The house was eerily quiet, the weight of the experience in the basement lingering like a ghost. He hadn't told anyone what had happened, of course. Who would believe him? But the urge had returned, the same insidious pull that had always haunted him. His hand trembled as he opened the browser and typed in the familiar address. The screen went black for a moment, then loaded a single line of text. Welcome back, Jacob. Ready to play again? Jacob's lips twitched, forming a hollow, broken smile. Just one more game, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The screen flickered, and the game began.